it would be awesome if we could chat about it and I didn't have to just talk for 50 minutes straight. So do you guys want to start with the project stuff, or do you want to start with the random conglomeration of other things I have?
Random conglomeration.
1 yay and 0 nays. All right. Seconded. Beautiful. Third. Okay, good. So we are officially doing this then. So you guys presumably are big fans of error handling already. Yes. And I imagine that by this point you've probably realized there are two ways that you can do it. Hopefully these somewhat sound familiar. Maybe you can say that a line is a statement followed by a semicolon. Right? That semicolon is actually part of the grammar, not part of the end of rule. So that looks reasonable, right? And you're like, well, I want to be able to somewhat handle errors. So I think it's really common for people to accidentally hold down shift. So I say that, right? So I say, okay, well, if you had a colon, I can have a really awesome error message that's YY error. That's a colon. Right, and then maybe you'll YY error, okay. Right, so that's awesome. It makes your error messages really, really specific because you know exactly what's happened, right? You wrote a rule for it. But then you're kind of in a tight spot now where you're like, well, what if they used a quote instead of a semicolon? Or what if they put the letter A instead of a semicolon? And you're like, well, there are a couple hundred ASCII keys I guess they could have put there, right? Am I really going to put a couple hundred rules to handle every error and give a beautiful message for each? It seems like a good idea. Very much like a good idea. Except that it's not. Because we didn't give you enough years to do that. So it might be more appropriate to do something like a line is a statement, semicolon, or a statement and an error. Right? So this grabs just about anything you could have written over there and sticks it here, right? Anything that doesn't match the rules that it expected, it's going to throw into error. It's going to parse it kind of somewhat like you would expect it. And you can call a YY error that you're no longer going to be able to say, that's a colon, but now you can say, well, that's not a semicolon, right? So you can at least give some message. And while we're on the subject, who knows what needs to be in your error message to get full credit? Line number? All right. So if you give me an error message that says you have a line number or you have a syntax error on line 7, do you think you should get full credit?
Probably not.
Probably not. Are there any other ideas as to what would be good? Eric?
At least some kind of general description about what went wrong. I wanted a semicolon here. There's nothing. It's not added.
Right. So Eric's saying that maybe we want what, some sort of helpful message, some sort of, this is kind of what we expected, what went wrong maybe. That's awesome. That'll get you full credit, but that's a little above and beyond. So I highly recommend those. Those are awesome, but they're not necessary. I see a hand in the back that I've never seen.
The token.
Token.
Where the error occurs.
Right. So we could call it maybe the last token and parsed. So at this point, sounds a little bit more like GDB probably, where you're like, syntax error on line 12, near the comma, right? I mean, you don't like, you can't be completely specific because errors can be really crazy. But at this point, at least, you're like, I can give you a general idea. Yes, Keith.
That's for full credit, just the line and the offending token.
I'm reading the spec and it says enough information is at least a line number to allow the user to locate syntax problems.
Okay, well, I asked DeBry, and this is what he said to me.
So the spec was a copy paste from the last one, basically.
I imagine so. But when push comes to shove, if you have the line number, you'll probably get like a 9 or something, right? This is probably for that like kind of extra point of awesome. If you really want to argue with him, I'm sure you could. That might be fun. Yeah.
I mean, that's not too bad.
Yeah, it's really not.
If you wanted to access the last token, could you access it by $2 on that example you have on the right? Like, how would you get the token to return?
So $2 would probably work out if you're setting YYLVAL appropriately throughout. Have you tried anything like that? Has anyone tried something like that?
No, I haven't actually gotten to that part.
Keith?
What was the question again, sir?
I'm sorry, the question was, if I'm putting an error message here, right? Error, blah, blah, blah. So I know what the line number is, right? That's a external int held in the scanner. Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't done it yet, right? But if I want to say the last token parsed, can I say $$ or $2?
The actual like, name of the token, like the text encounter?
Not the text encounter. So this would be the lexeme, not the token. Theoretically, if you're setting the YYLVAL appropriately for everything, then whatever match this should have a YYLVAL. The only problem is that, so I don't want to make promises because error is a really bizarre token, and error is not just like one thing necessarily, right? So if you have like a series of errors, they can all match the error token. So I don't know that this will behave correctly.
So how do you access the token then?
Well, that's the fun part. You get to find out. I'm not. Yeah, this might work. I mean, it's worth a shot, but you might have to try it out with things. Keith?
I'm just trying to understand the actual problem. Like, we just want the lexeme, right?
Sure, lexeme token, something around what you're doing.
If you're in YY error, you can access the name, like the actual text that is matched, and cause the error with YY text.
So there's the answer that I wouldn't give you. But so don't listen to Keith. He's cheating. He's right though. Yeah, you can use YY text.
Sorry. Can you say that again? No, I'm not allowed to.
Well, the cat's out of the bag. That's fine. All right then. I have no idea what just happened. So, what am I talking about? This is the minimum amount you need and the complete amount you need for a error message. So there's some question as to what happens if, let's say I've got a program and I'm really bad at writing programs, much like I am, right? And I'm going to use C and E for a correct piece and an error, right? So I have a correct piece and then some error and then a correct piece and then some error, right? How many errors should your program report? I heard 1 and 2, which are good because those are kind of the two possible answers. A 3 would have worried me, I suppose.
How about 0?
0 is probably the worst decision of all. So 1 or 2? 2? 2, 2, 2. Any last ones who'd like to defend their position? All right, so this makes sense, right? We want to recover from errors and continue parsing. So we see an error, we display some sort of helpful message, and then we get to all this good stuff. And so we parse it like normal. And we get to this error, and we give some set of message. So what if instead we had something like that? How many errors do you think we should report, probably? I see here lots of 2s. Ideally 4. That would be perfect. Absolutely. If you give me 4 really specific with line numbers and exactly how I should fix the problem, then you're the best compiler ever. You know, the reason we have the ideally qualifier is because you don't have to do that. GCC doesn't have to do that, right? And I think we can all agree that's a pretty decent compiler. So in this case, you're going to see all these errors, and Yak's going to be like, dude, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know where one error stops and the new one begins. So here's a giant error, right? And so your parser will see this error display one message that's like, I think an error happened way up here, right? And then you're going to fix it, and then this is going to turn correct, and you're going to have a new error, right? That's okay. You don't have to be superheroes with this parser. So this is acceptable, right? So somewhat related to error handling, but not necessarily. So I'm going to, well, I'll segue into it better than that, I guess. All right, so has anyone noticed, so with these YY errors that we're putting in braces, they're called like a semantic action. It means we do something, right? Because if you notice, if we don't have any of those, the parser never actually does anything, except for maybe tell you that you have an error. But with a perfect program, it doesn't do anything, right? We'll hopefully get around that at some point because we want to make code out of it. But does anyone notice that every rule we have some, you know, non-terminal and a colon, and then we have some stuff and a semicolon and some cool, and then we have semantic actions, right? We have action, 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 right? We could do 1,000 things in there. It doesn't matter. Have you noticed this is always at the end? Right? So maybe you've had rules, you've seen something like this, where you're like, well, what if the stuff is an error? Right? So you're like, well, okay, maybe you have an error, and then a semicolon, and then cool, and then I call YY error, right? Has anyone done something like this? Right? Does it behave like you would expect it to? Keith says no. Why not? What does it do? We don't know. Eric?
Would it even do anything? I mean, would that even get called by Yak? Because you said error is a pretty weird function, so maybe it's some kind of internal shift-reduce conflict and it doesn't know what to do, so it doesn't even go to that line.
This should work. Like, I mean, let's, for the sake of argument, say that stuff is a token, right? Because if it's a non-terminal, then we have some new issues. But let's just say that stuff and cool and the semicolon are all tokens, right? And so you feed this, you know, non-stuff, then a semicolon, and then cool. Yak's actually cool enough to match the things up until the semicolon as an error. It says, well, I wanted stuff and then a semicolon, and instead I got madness and then a semicolon. So it actually will reduce to the error all right, probably. I mean, it's not 100% predictable, but it should work. But there's still something kind of arguably counterintuitive that it'll do. So let's say I have a really awesome YY error message that says, you misspelled stuff, or something like that. When you actually give a false line to your program, to your compiler, right, that you've made, it's going to report 2 errors, right? It's going to say, one, it's going to say syntax error on, you know, line 3, and then the next line is going to be like your nice error message. And you're probably going to wonder, why am I getting this syntax error, the automated message by Yak? Right? Idea?
Can we put the code anywhere in that statement?
This?
Yeah.
We'll get to that very shortly. I'm building up to it. It's exciting. Palpable, right? Diana?
When it sees the error token,
Exactly. So when it reduces to error, right away it's like, hey, I'm in the error state. I don't know what's going on. I better call YY error. See how that goes. All right, so it calls YY error. And then it finishes with this error state. It sees the semicolon. It somewhat recovers. It sees cool. It's getting really happy. Then you're like, YY error. So it's like, oh, God, I'm in an error state again. Right? And then it gives you your helpful message. And maybe you've said YY error okay, so it gets less nervous afterwards, right? So this isn't necessarily ideal, but it's not necessarily devastating, right? I mean, you get like kind of double the messages you would expect, and one of them has a line number on it, and the other one also has the line number, but they agree. So you're like, all right, that's fine. There are like complicated ways I've heard of dealing with this, where you can have flags that you set in the error function, and you say, hey, I only want to actually report an error when it was me who's calling error. Right, so right before you call Y error, you say flag equals true, right? And otherwise it's false. And so when it calls YY error here, it sees the flag is false and it falls through. It doesn't do anything. That's cool for the minimizing the extraneous errors, but it also poses a problem that what if an error happens that you didn't catch, that only Yak caught, right? And if you're telling it only report errors that I say because I'm the smartest, and now there's an error that you didn't catch, that's kind of a problem, right? Your parser's going to crash every time, and the user's never going to know where the error was, or even that there was an error. It just thinks you're broken, right? So this is weird, but it's okay. This is the moral of that story. Are there any questions on that?
Wait, so we're allowed to have 2 error messages as long as they agree?
Yeah. I mean, because it still makes sense, right? If you're like syntax error 7, and you're like, oh, by the way, on line 7, you forgot a semicolon. It's awesome, right? Now, if your thing says syntax error line, -100, and you probably forgot a comma in line 3000, those are your 2 error messages, and there's no commas in my program, there's not supposed to be, that's a problem, right? So that'll be okay. So onto the idea that we have, right? These things are always at the end. We kind of wonder why, right? So I will say that you both can and can't at the same time have them in the middle. Yes. So I have handy dandy notes in my handy dandy notebook. So let's say you have a program of some sort, right? Is a proto, short for prototype because I'm lazy, or an actual function. Right? And then you have a proto is int id, right? That's the name of the function, and I'm saying it can only return integers, again, because I'm lazy. And then you have a left paren, some parameters, right? Param, close, and then a semicolon, right? So that makes sense for a prototype, right? You didn't actually declare what the function does. They're also called signatures, I think. Anyway, or you could have a function which is the same, right? I'm also imposing all these restrictions. But then I also have, let's just call it body, right? Nope. But maybe I want it here. I don't know, right? Sure. So we have these 2 diagonal declarations because I walked as I wrote. And let's say we actually want to do something. Let's sidestep error handling for a second because errors are weird. No one wants to talk about them. Let's say we actually want to do something semantically, like we were talking about earlier, right? So maybe we want to I'm going to put an arrow because I don't want to rewrite this. But let's say once we've seen that we're in a prototype of some sort, right? We want to set like variable scope to local rather than global or something, right? I mean, you'd probably want to do something more complicated, but for the sake of argument, let's say you're just changing the variable scope, and you have this means something through your parser that understands the symbol table and what local means, and you've done all that magic already. You're just trying to set the scope, right? So I told you that you could and couldn't put this here, right? Because you don't want to do it here. Because if you set at the end of your prototype, if after you've parsed everything, you're like, okay, now the scope is local, you've missed it. Like the whole time it was supposed to be local is global, and now that you're out of the prototype or the function or something, right, now it's local, and that doesn't make sense. Right, so you actually want to do it here. You need to have it here before you see the parameters, right? So Yak will let you do this. The way it does so is that it does some stuff under the hood, right? So you guys are familiar with the epsilon transition, right? So what it's actually going to do is it's going to make a rule, and it's called a non-terminal marker, which is handy because I'm using a marker. So it's called marker 1, right? And marker 1 is nada, right? It's just an epsilon. But when you do this, you actually get to do scope is local. So we've made this random marker rule, right, that doesn't actually do anything. It's an epsilon reduction. But when you actually invoke this reduction, it's going to set the scope to local. So what Yak is going to do is instead of actually have that be in the internal hood, it's going to put M1 right there, right? So it's going to parse along, and then it's going to reduce to M1. That action's going to happen, and we'll be happy. The problem here, in the way I've written, is our grammar used to be perfect, right? It used to have no conflicts. Now it does. Now it has a shift-reduce conflict. Why?
This is a function rule. It can either reduce to scope local, or it can shift that parentheses in the function.
Right. So the problem is when the dot, if you guys remember y dot output, is right here, right? It's looking at its next token, and it sees a left parentheses. It's like, well, I could shift it, assume that it's a function, right? Go along and end up reducing. Or I could reduce the epsilon to an M1, set the scope to local, and do this, right? So which rule is going to happen? What's its default action? Shift, right? So prototypes no longer exist in your language the way you've written them. That sucks. Brian?
Can you set like a precedence or something and tell it to evaluate the M1 first?
Evaluate the M. Okay, so the question is whether or not you can set a precedence to evaluate M1 first, right? So you're saying, can I say that I'd like you to go with this rule before this rule?
Yeah.
So the problem with that, right, is essentially you're telling Yak, okay, I see you have a shift-reduce conflict, and you normally shift. I want you to reduce instead, right? So that's, I don't think it's possible, and here's the reason, right? If you say, okay, reduce instead, well, now you've really not fixed your problem. What you've changed is you're like, well, I accidentally killed prototypes. Prototypes became unreducible. Now functions are unreducible. Because if I call this, I'm here, I see the left parentheses, and I say, don't shift, just reduce automatically. So I'm going to reduce the M1, set the scope. Now I'm in this rule. I'm no longer here, right? So this will never reduce.